Mark Carney, welcome to 7:30.
Thanks for having me, Sarah.
The head of Origin Energy recently described Australia's energy transition task as staggering. Now, can Australia realistically reach its emissions targets without an interruption to its energy supply?
Well, first point is that has to be the case. We're not going to shut down anything, any coal plant or other generation facility that's currently under operation until we have ramped up the replacements, the clean energy, whether it's wind, solar, battery storage, all those elements that could be put in place so that we can safely and reliably turn off the emission that has served the country well, but is now candidly part of the problem.
Now, we often hear that we need fossil fuels to aid in the transition, but what actually is the threshold where renewables can take over? At what point can we actually say, okay, renewables can take it from here? How are we to understand what that threshold point is?
Well, the first, I would say that the country's objective over the course of the next decade to get clean energy up from about 30% of the overall generation today to above 80% is achievable. It needs a mix of renewables, so there's no one answer. Obviously, I should say this, the country's doing an amazing job with rooftop solar. Australians are really coming through as individuals, as households, but we need more than that. We need wind, large-scale wind, to complement that, and a lot of our plan for Origin is to put in place that wind, but we also need storage capacity to help with that. And so there'll be a big build out of battery and storage on top of it. But you can get, sorry, Sarah, to that point, then you need to, that still has an element of gas peaking generation that is an important part of the mix at that point, which of course Origin has. And then one needs to think about what else can replace on the baseload side, and that will be part of the conversation, part of the development.
Let me just ask you a question about capital there, because of course for a task of this scale, billions, we know that billions of dollars are needed, and for that long-term investment security is essential. It's a sine qua non. You cannot do it without that security.
That's right.
So the question is, was the federal opposition here wrong to vote against the government's signature climate policy, its safeguard mechanism?
Well, I'm not going to delve directly into...
I suppose the question is, does it undermine the job that business has to do if they can't get bipartisan support?
Well, the first thing, look around the world and the experience around the world. What's necessary in order to achieve the goals that Australia has, Canada has, the world has in terms of the climate transition? The first is to be absolutely clear about what the objective is, not just net zero 2050, but where do you want to get to by the end of the decade? And this government has put in place that with legislation, so it's clear that's best practice. You see that in the UK, Canada, elsewhere. Now, in any democratic system, it's entirely right that different parties will have different views about the supported policy, but they need to be consistent with that objective. And yes, they do need to take into account literally the billions and billions of dollars that are being put in place.
What are we talking about here? More than $80 billion or something to...
As a whole, let me speak specifically to the situation Brookfield's involved in with Origin. We will invest over $20 billion in the transition for that big phase of transition towards getting off coal, building up a huge body of renewable and storage, 14 gigawatts to put specific numbers around it. So that's serious money. We are excited about doing that. We have the capability to do that. But part of the reason we're doing that now is because there is much greater policy clarity. We know where Australia is going. We know what the country wants, and that makes it possible to put the money
That sounds
forward.
like, although I know you don't want to delve into the internal politics of Australia, but in a way that is a reflection on the opposition not joining in. We're not talking about any ordinary policy here, and this is not me in favour or otherwise. Let me just finish the question, if I may.
Please, yeah.
Just given that the task is something akin to post-World War II reconstruction, my question is, do different rules apply outside of the norms of normal political to and fro?
Yeah, and I'd frame it this way. I'm glad you did finish the question, but I'd frame it this way. This is the industrial revolution at the pace of the digital transformation. That's what we're talking about. And again, the policies around that is hugely important because we're not going to, whether it's Australia, Canada, anywhere around the world, we're not going to divest our way to net zero. We need to go and invest, particularly where the emissions are. And in order to have that investment, yes, you do need clarity about the main elements of policy.
Let's talk about just one of the most important elements of the transition, or certainly one of the current debates here, which is around the life of Australian coal-fired power stations, in particular, in relation to the Eraring station. Now, do you accept the logic that its life may need to be extended to achieve dispatchable power during the transition, first of all?
Well, the first thing is, with Origin, recognize that Origin serves 4.5 million Australians. Those are their customers. It's pretty much a quarter of the electricity market. So we are not going to shut down Eraring until we have built the renewable and storage capacity and it's in operation such that we can responsibly do that.
So if there is a delay in achieving that transition capability, you can extend its life?
By definition, but let me make 2 points. One is that we shouldn't kid ourselves about extending lives of coal plants that are aged, that require capital expenditure. Now, the status quo is not the option. There's money that needs to be spent. The best place to spend the money is on the actual transition.
Now, is it a good use of public funds, however, for the New South Wales government to consider buying it back?
Whoever owns Eraring would have to own it consistent with what we've been talking about. Again, what the law of the land is in terms of transition.
So there's no possibility in your vision for Origin that you could lose control of the closing date for that coal-fired generator?
Look, I can't predict all possible scenarios, but just to be absolutely clear, there is no way for Australia to achieve its climate objectives if Eraring continues to operate as a central part of the generation for any longer than it should. And the should in that phrase is determined by the speed with which the renewable and the storage capacity is built up, and that's what we're going to do.
You've set out, you've been a long time, actually a very long time, longer than most people in your equivalent positions in this journey. But then we hit a massive global energy crisis. And you warned leaders around the world not to leave their net zero targets because of the pressures created by the war in Ukraine. But at the same time, in Australia, as everywhere else, we have consumers being punished very hard. How do you balance the push for net zero with the cost of living pressures?
The current system doesn't work. It's not fit for purpose. And it's not just about climate. It includes on issues of energy security and indeed on affordability. So we need to move. In the situation we have, governments here in Australia, Canada, elsewhere, well, more so in Europe actually than Canada, have had to take measures to support households with the higher cost of fuel. We've seen
that's how you do it.
Well, that's part, but also I think governments have recognized, virtually without exception, that this underscores the deficiencies of the system we have. And it has absolutely accelerated the transition towards a more sustainable and reliable system. We've seen it in policies from the US IRA through to the most recent Canadian budget, what's happening in Europe. So-called Inflation Reduction Act.
Massive investment in transitional energy.
Exactly.
Mark Carney, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure.